Hi, I'm Frida Weisel, and today I'm delighted to talk to Nathaniel Deutsch. Nathaniel Deutsch is a professor of history at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where he holds the Baumgarten Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies. He's the author of a number of books related to Hasidic history and culture, including The Maiden of Ludmir, A Jewish Holy Woman and Her World, The Jewish Dark Continent, Life and Death in the Russian Pale of Settlement, and most recently with Michael Casper, A Fortress in Brooklyn, Race, Real Estate, and the Making of Hasidic Williamsburg. He's currently developing the Minhag Project, a crowdsourced archive of Hasidic customs. Welcome and thank you. So I want to start by asking you to give us the meta-narrative of the story that is told in this extraordinary book on Hasidic Williamsburg and how this enclave came to be in North Brooklyn. So essentially, the introduction to the book frames the story, and I was hoping you can try to tell it to us.
Sure. So there's different things that the book tries to do. One of them is, of course, as you mentioned, a history of a particular Hasidic enclave in North Brooklyn in the neighborhood of Williamsburg, how it was created in the years immediately following World War II, in a place that for decades until that had been one of the most important Jewish neighborhoods in terms of its demographics, that is to say, in terms of the population, but also in terms of it was the most Orthodox Jewish neighborhood in New York City prior to World War II. One of the things we look in the book is why Hasidim, primarily from Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, Ukraine, areas that at one time were known as kind of Greater Hungary, arrived in Williamsburg, and how and why and how they were able to create the enclave there in the post-war years. So it looks at that. It also, I would say, another important contribution is adding a really new and important element to the standard historiography on American Jewish history, the standard kind of narrative of American Jewish history, especially in the 20th century, which has tended to focus on those Jews who came primarily from Eastern Europe, to a lesser degree from the Ottoman Empire, arrived in New York in the last couple of decades of the 19th century, first couple of decades of the 20th century, moved into areas like the Lower East Side, Maxwell Street in Chicago, neighborhoods in Boston, Cleveland, etc., quickly assimilated to American society, gave up Yiddish, gave up the kind of the traditional religiosity, let's say, that they had in Eastern Europe, and ultimately moved into the suburbs. And obviously that's a very, very important part of the American Jewish narrative, but it leaves out this other wave of largely Hasidic refugees who arrived in the post-war period and created communities not only in Williamsburg, but also in Borough Park, Crown Heights. Eventually, members of those communities will settle in upstate New York and elsewhere, and now are the fastest growing demographic within the American Jewish community and even the global Jewish community, which leads me to the third kind of one of the, let's say, the third major contribution, which is to say that this history that we look at the book helps us to get to the point where we are now, where Hasidim are the fastest growing community of Jews in the United States, in Israel, in Canada, I mean, in a variety of other places. So if we want to look at the future of Jews globally speaking, it's important to know this past. And then, of course, there are the contributions that the book makes to the history of New York City, because Hasidim have played a key role, especially in the history of Brooklyn in the post-war period. They're one of the biggest communities in Brooklyn, certainly in North Brooklyn, although there are significant kind of pockets in other parts of Brooklyn as well. And then, of course, they play a key role, as we argue in the book, in the gentrification of North Brooklyn. Williamsburg itself, which is arguably the most famously gentrified and most intensely gentrified neighborhood in New York City, and perhaps even the world. It became a global symbol of gentrification, but also increasingly in the rest of North Brooklyn and in areas that, pretty far from Williamsburg, such as East New York, and so on. And then lastly, of course, Hasidim didn't just play a role in gentrification as, for example, real estate developers or landlords, things we look at carefully in the book, but also they were, as it were, victims of gentrification insofar as many Hasidim who are working class, and that's another very important part of the book that many people don't realize, is that Hasidim arguably now are the largest working class segment of the American Jewish population, and are involved in many trades, many of them connected to real estate, but not all. By real estate, I mean not just the, people often think about the landlord or the developer side when it comes to Hasidim, but there's many Hasidim who are truck drivers, who work in lumber yards, who are plumbers, who are involved in that side. And in that respect, those people who desperately need affordable housing, like other members of working class communities in New York City, have been driven out of neighborhoods where, let's say, their parents or grandparents lived for decades because of high prices. So I know that's a lot to put on the table because there's a lot going on in the book, and that's one of the reasons why I was attracted to do the project to begin with.
How long did it take you, the whole project?
From sort of start to finish, I was working on other stuff, and Michael Casper, my co-author, was also doing that. Let's see, probably around 13 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I learned so much from the book, and it is such there are so many sources. Did you go through the number of, since I look at some of the resources myself,
yeah,
it was that on steroids tenfold, and I can't bother to look at, for instance, Hasidic Twitter and Couch Table and all of that, but those are all framing the story as well. And it's really what comes out, and which is something I struggle myself to frame as part of the humanization of the Hasidic community, is the multiple opinions and personalities that comprise this world. But I want to ask you, because this is something that I turn over my own head. You were talking about the Jewish American story of immigration and immediate assimilation. One generation we have assimilation, and I wonder, in the book, there's something of a reflection of the move towards luxus, towards maybe more luxury. And I see it very strongly everywhere. It's very striking to me, especially in Borough Park, but it's creeping into especially New Williamsburg. So I guess I wonder if there are parallels to the American assimilation story in a Hasidic way.
That's interesting. Yes. So you're pointing to something which is very notable in the Satmar community in particular, which is the largest Hasidic community, obviously, as you know, in Williamsburg, in the world, actually. Satmar goes from being a very, minor in terms of its size within the broader kind of Hasidic world prior to World War II, although significant within Hungary for a variety of reasons, because its leader, Joel Teitelbaum, was from the most important Hungarian Hasidic lineage, and also because he was already, even before World War II, he had distinguished himself for a kind of political savvy, even though on the one hand, but also connected to the fact that he was also very ascetic and very, very focused on Kedusha, on holiness. So I say even though, because on the one hand, you would say those two things are kind of separate. Right. And certainly throughout his career, he had, his disciples and his inner circle will try to keep him separate from certain things because of his Kedusha, his holiness. But at the same time, it's his Kedusha and the perception of that on the part of his followers that gave him a lot of the power, and that was the source of his charisma. And so part of that was a rejection of luxus, of luxury. Now, I should say that although there have been some notable exceptions in Hasidic history of rebbes who were, who had fancy carriages, who had palaces, and so on, I would say that if you look at the longue durée, the long history of Jewish religious leadership, that is the exception. The ideal has much more typically been rejecting the material.
An aesthetic.
Yeah, much more of that. Not extreme asceticism, because that's also critiqued.
Right.
Already
But not like the original was, or what was the one who went with the gold boots?
Yeah,
so there's the Satmar Rebbe's. Are you saying the Satmar Rebbe's position was sort of a typical Hasidic?
Yeah, I would say the Satmar Rebbe's is more in line with the longer history of already going back to rabbinic texts. The notion that it's let's put it this way: there's a certain tension within Judaism about wealth. On the one hand, you can find statements in traditional sources that would describe wealth as a reward for something good. On the other hand, you also find texts that do talk about the dangers of wealth, and the dangers of wealth in a spiritual sense. And in Hasidism, there's a particular tension because of the tension between what's called Gashmias and Ruchnias, between materiality and spirituality, which is not just about money, right? So it ends up being, I don't want to get into the complications of it, but it's actually a very complicated, important question of luxus. It's not just about the American, the potential of becoming contaminated by American materialism. It has a much longer history, and it's and even within Hasidism. But however, as you point out, there was a particular fear about America as a place in which materialism, in which luxury would contaminate even the most religious Jews. And Satmar, part of its success was to reject luxus, materialism, precisely at the moment, that is the 1950s, when the American government, when corporations, when some of it connected to efforts to, to continue to build the economy in the post-war period. And a lot of scholars have studied this. There were a lot of factories that were producing military material that then had to shift to something else. And so they encouraged consumerism as a way of maintaining the production with those factories, but now shifting to peacetime, goods. And so on. And of course, highways that encourage people to move out to the suburbs, which was also encouraged by real estate industry to build housing, all of this, right? TV, which creates advertising opportunities, all of this is like ground zero for all of this. And in that moment, the Satmar Rebbe, he says, no, you can't have TV.
Wow.
You can't, luxus is you have to reject luxus. And when I say they had gatherings of the different Haredi leaders, not only Hasidic, where luxus was one of the primary questions that primary issues that they were debating and trying to critique. So that's a key element, ironically, again, of their success, because very much of Satmar's success, certainly in the first few decades, was because they were swimming against the currents of the day. And the people were empowered by feeling like they were doing something different, something holy. And what's the biggest sign of that? That actually the majority disagrees with you. You see, now
the outside of the community, the
exactly.
Jewish public,
the American public, all of that. Because of course, within Judaism itself, there's a long tradition. I mean, that's arguably that is the key of Judaism already from the Torah, already from the Hebrew Bible, is that you will be, you won't. It says in the book of Numbers in the Bible, it says, you won't be counted among the nations. You shall stand up, people who stands alone, and it shall not be counted among the nations. You see? So that idea, what's called the Machane Yisrael, the camp of Israel, that gets articulated in this way too. So now, fast forward to what you're pointing to, which is the luxury, the what you see, you know, where people are taking trips to Switzerland in off season, where they're, you know, for Passover, they're going to a hotel in Florida. You know, I mean, there's a million things we could point to, right, which has shifted. What does that reflect? Is it another version, as you suggested it might be, of like this American, the standard American thing, that the working class immigrants arrive, they, after a few generations or maybe even earlier, they make some money, they then become Americanized in part by doing this, by becoming, you know, going into luxury? It's a good question. I mean, you probably have better insight than I do as to whether that's part of what's going on there, you know?
I don't know. I feel like I don't know enough about the 1950s. You know, the Philip Rothian character of repression in the gilded comfort of status, that strikes me as resonant. That's where I bring it from. But I see a very, very important distinction, which is that the Satmar Hasidim are inside a system which, if they exit it, if they assimilate, they lose the entire deal. So it can never go in the way that it had gone with American Jews, because that makes the whole thing fall apart. That's
interesting. So I see. So the question is, though, how far can they go in the materialism, the new materialism, or in the, you know, without the whole thing kind of tipping?
Right. Well, what I see is that the community economy is dependent on growth. There's always new businesses for the new people, and that is dependent on people not leaving, which is very unusual for an immigrant community. You start out somewhere, and instead of moving up, you stay.
Yeah.
And if people were to move, which is the American story, then this whole thing falls apart. You start to lose the growth, you lose the industries, you lose the network of information.
Right. I guess there's two more things I would add. One is just directly related to what you just said, which is that actually, I think if you look at broad patterns of within the United States, people remaining closer to home has increased dramatically compared to previous decades.
Mobility's gone down.
Yeah, mobility has gone down. You know, being able to move from one class position to another has gone down, but also I think horizontally. I mean, there are cases, of course, where people are moving to Texas or to Florida, et cetera. But compared to the past, I think that, and I don't know how this will be affected by the COVID pandemic or not, I'm not sure, but I think that there's been less mobility in that regard. And then the second thing is that I do think that, especially with Hungarian Hasidim, there was always some tension between that anti-Luxus attitude that was coming from the male religious leadership, especially, and then the broader kind of Middle European, Central European, you know, attitudes towards fine things. Food and clothing and furniture and so on, which was more possible and more of a cultural, let's say, ideal, I think, among the Hungarians than it was, for example, among the Poles or the Russians, just because of the economic development and cultural development of Austro-Hungary versus like the Russian Empire, for example.
Oh, that's very interesting, because we had a very strong self-identity of, we like nice things, you know.
Right. Yeah.
And more so than any information about Luxus. The word Luxus actually just reminds me of Yom Tov Elach, because he has a song.
Yeah.
It's called Luxus. But it especially I think for women, it's a self-identity part.
Well, let me give you a little story about my father. So my father is from a Hungarian Haredi family, and his mother would put coins in his dumplings to get him to eat it.
What? Really? How do you eat coins?
You don't eat them, you find them.
You eat around it.
She felt like he was too thin. She felt like he was too thin.
It's like the smearing the fat on the sandwich.
Exactly. So that speaks to a, I mean, I give that, it's not necessarily exactly revealing about this, but it's part of a broader, interest in food, like pride in food, and also desire, and that's, you need to eat, you need to, I mean, there's other examples I could give that would probably be better, but somehow that one was the one that came to my mind.
Like being skinny is not
being
nice.
skinny is not, yeah, and also just the idea that your food would not be, that people wouldn't like your food since it's this amazing, I don't know, maybe that's a more universal thing, but somehow there was, yes, I think that there was a tension, but I think that what's going on now is not so much a trace of let's say that earlier historical tension, and is now has to do with certain trends in, whether it's assimilation, whether it's the exposure of Hasidim to contemporary American, culture, just as, Hasidim or Haredim in Hungary were exposed to Hungarian, broader Hungarian, or, the Austro-Hungarian culture.
Yeah.
There's never a separate, no matter how separatist you are, you're always still being exposed and influenced by these things.
Of course. The pandemic, for instance, brought in an influx of subsidies for children, families with a lot of children. I think, for instance, that's an example of where it immediately translates into that increase in luxus. Of course, it stimulates the local economy enormously as well. It just raises the entire thing. I have a bunch of questions. I know I'm not going to remember anything. Oh, do you mind if I ask you what your connection? You told me that you seem to have family relations.
Very, distant. I'm distantly related to some people in Williamsburg, but certainly not Hasidic. Didn't grow up Hasidic. Didn't grow up in Williamsburg. Because of my family background, there are some of the people that I write in the book are distantly related to me, but not in the way that I, grew up knowing them or anything like that. So, like my grandmother is from Pupa,
I see, Papa. From the town of Pupa.
And
but not Hasidic Pupa.
No, and she was a cousin of Moshe Hoffman, who's the founder of Shomrim. Her last name was Hoffman as well.
I see.
So that's one example. There are other ones I could give, but that's already a distant thing. And my grandparents, my father, this is my father's side, my mother's side is were actually originally Hasidic in Poland, but then became labor Zionists. And so my father's side is Hungarian, Haredi, and they, before the war, moved to Antwerp, and then came to the U.S. as refugees, and then lived in Borough Park. Wow. And my grandfather was a diamond dealer originally in Antwerp, and then on 47th Street, as well as many other male relatives in my family. So from that, I have some, acquaintance, but not as an insider within the community.
Do you speak Yiddish?
I do speak it, but not very well.
But you read it?
I read it well, and I speak it well enough to be able to be present and to communicate with people, to be present at things like, a tish or something like that. And then also, in terms of the ethnography that I've done, I actually use the fact that I don't speak it well to
open people up.
Yes.
I know the tricks. Yeah. People don't trust you very much when you sound too Heimish,
Yeah, so I try to, but you know what, it's actually, I should say that, on the one hand, that is the case. On the other hand, I would say that I'm genuinely trying to learn, obviously, and I also realize that people are genuinely interested in me in this kind of strange, not exactly this, not exactly that. One thing that I always found interesting in Williamsburg was when I would talk to people, people always ask me, like, is it hard to talk to people in Williamsburg, in Hasidic Williamsburg, I mean, and I'd say, no, it actually isn't. I'm not saying that it couldn't be for certain people, but in my case, it wasn't. So that's more of less a general observation than just a personal observation.
But why wasn't it?
It wasn't because people were just, it's like, to me, you spoke about humanizing this community. And I would say that's a really important point, because like any community, some people, when I say it wasn't, that doesn't mean that like there weren't people who didn't want to talk to me or who were brusque or rude, right? But it's like any community, like some people are friendly, some people are not. Some people want to talk, some people not. Some people are curious, some people are not. So it's really just a matter of spending enough time and making enough effort so that you encounter the people who are willing to talk and are curious. And you can even learn things from the people who aren't, potentially as well. So people would always ask me, like, what I was going to say is, like, people would always ask me, like, what's your name, especially the last name?
You're Jewish.
Where is your family from? So when I say my last name, then immediately is
Deutsch.
Yeah.
They take out the phone book.
Yeah. Where is your family from? And then what's your family status? Meaning, like, are you married? Do you have kids? They wouldn't say status. Are you married? Do you have kids? Which always, I mean, that struck me as revealing. Like, that's how you're placing someone in a variety of different ways. And so
they don't ask you if you're Jewish, or they assume?
No, they wouldn't necessarily assume that I was or I wasn't. I mean, I would dress this the way that I usually dress. There was no, like, I certainly wasn't trying to, fit in any way, because that's not who I am, but also it would be impossible anyway.
Yeah, of course.
So I think that sometimes they were curious about that, sure, but then that's what they say, like, oh, what's your name? What are you doing here? Where's your family from? That may have been another way of asking, are you Jewish? It was rare for somebody to say, are you Jewish? Although I'm sure that some people were curious about that.
I see.
Some people asked if I was Haredi, even though I'm not wearing a yarmulke, I'm not, because we would be talking about certain things, and then they were just, it was like a cognitive dissonance.
Why you knew things that a Haredi person knows.
Right. So the easiest thing was to just assume that I was Haredi, even though I would say I'm not, and then that would provoke. So I guess my unusual background and so on was helpful in the sense that it often did lead to conversations, and also I had a sense of what was going on. But also people were curious about me, and some people may have been, interested because I wasn't Haredi or Hasidic, but I sort of understood things. That's a whole thing that we don't get into that in the book at all, because
I know.
It
interests me. It interests me about the process of research, because I find my process of penetrating that community, which of course they're very reluctant, they're very curious when they figure out my accent, but I find it very defined by gender, extremely defined by gender. First of all, I can't enter male spaces, but also the women don't really talk to us, rarely, and the men almost wink, like a familiar little, we can't really talk here because people see, but what's your deal? What are you doing? I think it's a very interesting, also part of the understanding how this community sees itself in terms of connecting to outsiders, if there's any change in how they I think the earlier post-Holocaust generation was less sheltered, less curious, maybe. in the sense that they
Yeah.
just had to keep interacting.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Well, for example, like that's my grandmother, but my grandfather, he spoke many languages and was very, aware of stuff. You know what I mean? Yeah, that is, when I say stuff, I mean not only what was going on in Borough Park or the broader, Orthodox Jewish world, but more generally. But remember, these are, of course, people that even in Europe, they may have been exposed to a lot more, but also they were refugees, and they were, traveled. They had to deal with, they had to know things just to survive, and they were living in multiple places. Often, so you have to, when you're forced to move from place to place, you're also learning about this new place. And I definitely think that in some ways those generations were more cosmopolitan, but then again, nowadays, Hasidim have access to the internet, and that is provides information and exposure to things that people in the earlier generation never would have been exposed to.
Yeah. So. Do you think there is a need for quickly preserving the stories of the people of that era, because it's pretty much, there are some people I've spoken to along my journey in this community that are no longer around. I try to hunt them down to get more information there. So I'm wondering if this is a story that's been completely told, because there was Kranzler, there have been, as things develop, there have always been historians and sociologists who've tried to record it, but I'm not quite sure if the whole story is told.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, what's interesting is that there's often a stereotype. It's actually a very old stereotype, centuries old, of the Jew as a white bearded old man. And I think there's a stereotype. When I say stereotype, I also mean like the media image of the Chassid, or of Hasidim, is often like the older or old, bearded man. But in fact, Hasidim are probably the youngest community in New York City, right? In terms of the age.
Of course, the median age is in the teens.
Exactly. So the number of old people is actually very, very small, not only relative to the overall Hasidic population, but just in absolute terms. The people who were of that generation, most of them, like anyone there who was of that generation, has passed away. So there really are fewer and fewer people. Certainly very few people who experienced the Holocaust, for example, or who were there in the first few decades of the founding of the community in Williamsburg. So it is very important to capture those stories, to some extent, you can't talk to the people anymore who were involved, because even by the 1970s, a lot of the founders had passed away. But you can try to reconstruct it through historical sources or through the things that they wrote. And so that's why, in our book, we take that approach. You mentioned that we looked at a lot of different sources. Well, I don't think it's possible to understand any Hasidic community without looking at what is produced by Hasidim. Talking to people is super important, of course, but also one of the things that characterizes, as you well know, and actually your website is a really interesting kind of digital archive, it is a digital archive of different kinds of sources that are produced all the time by Hasidim. Some of it is the posters.
Street posters.
Yeah, I mean, those are very, very interesting and important. And then also, of course, newspapers, and now there's websites. But then there's also different, what are called Sfarim. There's halachic literature, which is for some questions, is quite important. Then there's letters again, that's a genre.
Yeah, of
letters.
rebus.
Exactly. Then there's what scholars call hagiography, meaning
the stories that they tell.
Exactly. And there's lots of collections of those. What's interesting about Satmar is that there are also kind of historians within the community who actually have done a great job in a lot of ways collecting lots of different kind of documents, not only stories, which would be more typical, but also other kinds of things, information, photos, all sorts of materials that then get published. Usually they're almost always published in Hebrew or Yiddish. And then on a few occasions, there's also English versions, but and then there's like little pamphlets and things like that a synagogue, might publish.
Ashkaville or
No,
the Kuntres.
It's
the
like
Kuntres, like in the.
It's like takanas. So takana is like a ordinance.
Right.
It's a legal genre where, let's say, a congregation will say, okay, here's a takana having to do with weddings, like how much a wedding can cost, or some other thing that's responding to what you say, like an acute halachic question, like a question that has, sometimes it's halachic specifically, but sometimes it's, let's say, broadly, like how should the members of this community or congregation behave when it comes to a certain issue or question. So you issue a takana. Sometimes the takana could be historically for a whole region. Sometimes it could be just for a congregation. So there are things like that for some of the congregations within Williamsburg. And those are where you could call those ephemera, in the sense that, that was just published maybe 100 copies. But it turns out that, for example, the New York Public Library has some of these. Somebody has been collecting a lot of things like that for the New York Public Library for decades. Who
preserved their Yid?
Well, their Yid is in the New York Public Library. Actually, the collection there is probably better than in YIVO. It's more complete. The people at the New York Public Library have been collecting all sorts of stuff. It's an amazing archive of this. Yeah, all sorts of things. Books by some of the most important figures like Nathaniel Deutsch, but also some of the things that I was describing. There's a lot of very, very interesting things in there. So that's a very good source. And one of the things that we try to do in the book is to capture what's called the hashkafa, the worldview that underlies a lot of the decisions, because a lot of scholars, say a lot of academics that are working in universities, they will perhaps do a good job of describing a certain event, but they're not necessarily trying to or able to identify the hashkafa, let's use that word, the worldview that helps to explain why, let's say in this case, Satmar took a particular position, or how they expressed it in their Yid to the community.
The public, yeah.
Exactly.
But is it necessarily the religious aspect of it, or is it the whole cultural belief system that moves things?
Right, that's a great question. I mean, I don't think the two can be separated, because as you know, when you're talking, there might be a certain thing like housing, like gentrification. So in literary studies, there's this thing called register, like that a work of literature can operate on multiple registers, multiple levels. Okay, and that's the way that Hasidic texts, and I would consider like an article in Der Yid, at least, especially like in the olden days, and some now still, but would work. That's a Hasidic text too, just like something that's just like Ve'ol Moshe, which is this very important anti-Zionist text that was written by Yoel Teitelbaum. That's a text. That one's more obviously a Hasidic text maybe than the newspaper, but in fact, the newspaper is the text too, Hasidic text. What do I mean by that? It means that they might start out with a thing where they're referring, maybe they will publish something on a particular date that's significant in the Jewish calendar. Or they might have a demonstration. Usually they'll have a demonstration on a particular date. If they can choose between 1 or 2 dates to have the demonstration, they might have a demonstration on a date that has a significance in Jewish history, because maybe it was the date when the Romans, were surrounding, Jerusalem, and, etc. So, and then they'll refer to that. And then they'll quote. They might quote from the Bible, and then they'll quote, and then in talk they'll go da 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 da, and then they might quote from the Gemara, from the Talmud, somewhere else, another thing. And so it's working like, and so all the demonstration that's maybe taking place on Broadway in Williamsburg is now part of a much longer it's part of Jewish history. And it's also part of this worldview that Jewish communities, Jewish fortresses, Jewish spaces have been under siege by these external forces since the Beis Hamikdash, since the temple in Jerusalem. And part of what happens under those circumstances is there are Jews within the fortress, within the community, who are helping the people who are laying siege. And that's what's going on in Williamsburg. So, according to them. So, the way things get framed is in these ways, and that's what provides the emotional energy. If it were just,
Fire.
you see what I'm saying? If it were just the gentrifiers coming and they're, raising the prices, that will be bad enough for some people, but not for Hasidim. I mean, let's for the real Hasidim, right? Like my Hasidim, for them, it has to be connected to these other things. And so what's interesting is that it's not, in certain ways, the financial aspect of it, although of course very, very important, and for some people it'll be the most important thing. When you read the text, they will typically emphasize this other aspect.
Religious.
Exactly. And it's religious in the sense of it's really connected to their view of what it means to be a Jew in Jewish history, but also their ability to overcome it and survive. This is a key thing. This is part of one of the key aspects of this story is survival and rebuilding. Yeah. Which I would say for the Hasidim who survived the Holocaust, that is that's the idea that they were connected to generations of Jews, other Jewish generations who did that, gave them the ability to keep on going forwards, and it provided an enormous amount of meaning and strength and pride. And it's really very much a story about pride as well. Pride for a people who, and here it is about Jewish history, and it's also about specifically in more recent history of anti-Semitism, is pride for a people who were treated like garbage, who were literally hunted down, enslaved, ghettoized, murdered, experimented on, etc. We can't forget that. So that has a big psychological effect as well. And so this book is it's not just, that's why I say it's not just the religious stuff, has to do with the effects of modern racialized anti-Semitism, which happen to connect with a certain traditional Jewish perspective on Jewish embattlement, survival, and so on. But it has its own modern version, as it were.
It's like there is a very strong survival instinct, and all tools are recruited in the effort towards that survival, be it the religious, the economic.
It's a good question. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely true, and that's where you end up with a certain kind of pragmatism too, that those tools that are recruited, as you put it. I also think survival itself has become over the centuries, and maybe from the very beginning, if you look at the earliest Jewish texts, a key defining feature of what it means to be Jewish.
But modern Jews have lost that whole narrative.
That's interesting. Yeah, perhaps many, but definitely the Hasidic community in Williamsburg did not lose that. Let's put it that way.
Actually, speaking of this, do you see parallels between the creation of Israel, which is another story of Jewish survival?
Yes. That's fascinating. You know what? Even after writing the book, I thought more about this. That's an excellent point. We do allude to it in the book, but in certain ways, I would say it could be expanded on, and maybe expanded on exactly in this way, which I don't think we really get into in the book. What you just said, it's true. In the book, we allude to the fact that Rabbi Yoelish, the Salmon Rabbit, the founder of Hasidic Williamsburg, he, I think, was trying to create a parallel Jewish universe / alternative to the state of Israel, which he saw as the work of Satan. That's not even an exaggeration. He literally says that. So he was trying to show, look, here in Williamsburg, this most unlikely place in certain ways, right? We can create something that competes with successfully and shows how a Jewish life can thrive outside of the land of Israel. But you're right that this focus on survival is something you find both in Williamsburg and in the state of Israel. And even though they take such different directions, that is potentially or arguably like the engine that's driving both.
Would you say both are sort of very much a product of the Holocaust, in the sense that that was what really fired the engine?
I mean, they both existed prior to it, because, the Salmon Rabbit was already he already envisioned or dreamed of a kind of separatist community. And it's also the case that Hungarian Haredi, one of the ways of framing or understanding Satmar is actually outside of the Hasidic context. It's in the Hungarian Haredi context.
The dramas there with the reformers.
And they're exactly. And they define themselves as separatists, as rejecting reform, the Enlightenment, and so on. And actually, we do allude to this in the book too. In certain ways, you could say Satmar is the least Hasidic of the Hasidic communities and the most Hungarian Haredi. Meaning, it is Hasidic, of course, in a variety of ways.
It's the least Hasidic of the Hasidic communities, in the sense that it's the most deviant of the Hasidic traditions.
It's the one in which the Hungarian Haredi worldview
is more dominant.
I think so.
The approach to Rebbes, for instance?
Approach to Rebbes, there's certain skepticism. I mean, you see this often in the Salmon Rabbit's sense of humor, which he had, from what I can gather, a kind of incredible sense of humor and very sort of sardonic, would constantly make jokes and just kind of cynical. Yes, exactly. Cynical. He was kind of he would undermine things and question things that maybe, in other Hasidic communities, they would not want to touch because it might undermine a certain perception of the world and so on. He was, and his attitude towards the Chassam Sofer, who's the founder of Hungarian Haredi Judaism, was extremely...
He really connected into his...
Yeah. He would study, he would learn him all the time, every day, he said. His approach was modeled in certain ways, although there are some differences. But so, yeah, I mean, I think that that we were talking. What your question or your comment was?
We completely.
Yeah.
We were talking about Israel. We don't have to finish the thread. Yeah. we can go Hasidic style. You start one place and we end in a completely different place.
True. Why
Yeah. You know what? Then let's go to a different thing.
Sure.
Unless it's going to bother you. Is it going to be like an
Not at
earworm?
all.
Okay.
Not
All
at all.
right. You know, someone had said this to me, and actually I haven't studied enough of American immigration story to actually have verified it, but that part of what made America hospitable to Hasidim after the war was an increase in multiculturalism. I haven't verified that myself. So I'm wondering if that is true, and if so, if that is changing, because definitely the conservative part of America is complaining that it is, that there's a growing lack of tolerance, maybe.
I think that that's probably true. The first point about the increase in multiculturalism, although I don't think in the 1950s that was pretty. I mean, I would like to see whether they made the case, whoever is making this case, whether they made it for the 1950s, because the 1950s arguably was a high point of sort of conformity. You see what I mean?
Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe earlier.
Yeah. So I don't know about that. I do think that in the 1960s, you can start to see that occurring. And Satmar, for example, is aware of that. Now you mentioned, you know, all the using all the tools, the toolbox, as it were, to survive. Well, they become one of the things we look at closely in the book is how they become very aware of the new focus on racial and ethnic identity and on the rights of such communities to when it comes to voting, when it comes to
benefits,
all of this, right? And they that really is an important part of their story starting in the late 1960s and moving forwards. Now, you know, it's a complicated question because on the one hand, you find, you know, and some scholars are looking at this now, alliances between at least some Hasidim and some conservatives from other backgrounds. When I say from other backgrounds, that implies that many Hasidim are conservative, which I think is accurate and always has been. I mean, in a political sense, I mean, as far as you can't get the statistics that we can now, or at least try to get now when it comes to voting and so on. But it's definitely the case that going back to the beginning of the 20th century, you would see certain political conservatism among Haredim more generally.
How so?
Just in terms of their attitudes towards socialism, for example.
Gotcha. Because they don't really care.
Haredi socialists too.
Sure, that's different. Yeah, I'm sure that's a big difference.
There was Poale Agudas Yisrael. There was a branch of Agudas Yisrael, which is the main Haredi party that started in Poland, that was a socialist branch, which is little known now. It's something I've been looking at more recently, but in general, that wasn't the case. You know, in general, it was more conservative, I would say, politically speaking. You could say, though, that in the last few years, it's become even more so.
Well, why? I'm not quite sure. Because they don't care about broader conservative issues. They don't care about abortion. They don't care about gay marriage. They don't. I mean, there's always a few people who put posters up whenever there's a. Yeah. But
I would say, just in terms of like the voting for Trump, for example, is a kind of an indication of some of that, at least when it comes to the presidential elections. You know, how deeply it's felt is a good question. You know, how much of it was around him as a candidate and how much of it is, you know, a broader shift, I think is a really good question. I don't have an answer to that one, but because you're right. I mean, there are things that would indicate differences between, let's say, Hasidim, even those who vote for Trump, and others. And then there were, you know, and as you know very well, you know, there's also a lot of different viewpoints. You might do one thing, but then have other views or not care, you know what I mean? About other things. So I think it's a really great question, and one that's likely to be explored by a lot of people as moving forwards, especially as the Hasidic community or Haredi community more broadly gets larger and
becomes more dominant voting.
Yeah, in certain places at least, yeah.
Well, I guess I see the voting for Trump in part as a kind of endorsement of a male macho man, you know, which I think comes, I guess we can say, comes from a conservatism, a kind of, it's some kind of conservatism, voting for that figure of the man, which I sometimes thought was sort of parallel to the rebel in the big theatrical male.
Yeah.
In the
It's
secular
an
realm.
interesting point, and it may be that for some it is definitely connected to that. I think, look, what you're pointing to also is how the term conservative has to be kind of you have to investigate it when applied to a group like Hasidim, because there's all these other things like there's conservative, there might be economic position, there might be kind of patriarchal conservatism, which you're talking to, but then there might be other ways in which it might be. Then there's issues like social issues, which might to some degree be connected when it comes to abortion or gay rights, etc. But then there might be some other things in which the position is not conservative. And actually, they've done interesting surveys in Israel among Haredim, and demonstrated that actually Haredi attitudes towards socialist economic policies, support for those has been going up, even as the general support among the overall Israeli population has gone down for those policies since the 1970s. And yet, of course, Haredi voters in Israel will often support politically conservative governments that nevertheless carve out space, at least historically, for some social programs that benefit Haredim specifically or disproportionately. And so that's allowed a certain kind
new
of
political creature.
Yeah, this kind of interesting situation where, like, if you were to just look at the attitudes around socialist economic policies, you might say Haredim are more likely to be socialists or leftists at least. But then when you look at their attitudes towards other things, they tend to be more conservative. And that was one of the secrets of Likud, was to satisfy, to be politically conservative in certain ways while still having policies, and in another context might be seen, at least for some part of the population, as more, let's say, socialist. But by socialist I mean state-funded.
Right, state. I get it, and which applies to Hasidim. It's also why I have a hard time with the whole calling them conservative. David Meyer asked us that question, right, at the panel we were both on, and I to me the question comes out of where does this question come out of? Because the parallels are not really there for me because of the social programs.
Right. I think it's a matter of that it probably the starting point should be, it's obviously very complicated. You know what I mean? Like, how do we explain what seem to be, if not contradictory, then kind of things that are going on that in some other community might not go together, but yeah.
I think the book did really well complicated, which I really liked. I think that it's really easy to flatten in order to say, oh, it's too much, let me just flatten the whole thing. But it needs to be complicated. That's essentially it's truth, it's makeup. But I really don't want to finish before I ask you one of the questions that I was most interested in. You actually didn't touch on it on the book, but in the book, except maybe tangentially, which is the big education debate. Because there are several instances in the book where there was a mention of the Talmud as driving the community. People are self-reporting that the Talmud is the success of the community.
Yes.
But there is this huge chasm between the mainstream narrative of a community on welfare, uneducated, and the narrative in this book.
That's such an important question, and also a complicated question, because if you talk to some people within the community, and here I'm referring to men, because as you know, the relationship between men's education, there's a difference between men's education and women's education. And so what I'm about to say is relevant for men's education much more so, because it has to do with learning these traditional Jewish texts for long periods of time, especially the Gemara, that is the Talmud. You will hear some people saying, or I have heard some people saying, oh, this prepares us for learning other things.
Sitting with the Talmud, and it prepares you for real estate, for instance.
Real estate, somebody, I've talked to a lot of people about this. Oh, there's math and a certain masech and a certain tractate, and even though we don't study math, I learned some of it from this, and so on. So that's one approach that's taken. Another approach is that some people will have said to me, well, it's true that we don't learn, they won't make the argument that you can transpose the Talmudic learning to the other kinds of learning. They'll say, well, even though we don't learn the other stuff, we're very successful as entrepreneurs. And people have even asked me, like, can you get me statistics on like will ask me to make sense of the Pew study. Like I was trying to figure it out, but I couldn't figure it out. I'm thinking one person recently, could you send me, could you send it to me, the relevant thing, and also explain? Because they want to make the case that actually, even without the education, the outcome is, if not, might even be better than like other sub-communities of Jews. On the other hand, of course, I have talked to, I've talked to one, education scholar who said from the studies that he's seen, that kind of education in one area, like the Talmud will say, doesn't in fact typically translate into success in another, in let's say in this case secular, being able to learn things in other realms. And in addition, you have people who are Hasidim or were formerly Hasidim, who will talk about terrible outcomes. That they felt like they weren't prepared to get jobs, and especially when they leave, that it's this very traumatic and if not lasting, years lasting impacts. So you hear all of these different things, or I've heard all of these different things. And then, of course, you have the legal question of what are they legally bound to do, which is also by the state of New York, where most of them live. And then, which is, of course, a political question, too, because politicians over the years have treated this as a third rail, maybe the third rail when it comes to the Hasidic community. The one thing you don't want to touch leading up to an election. Yeah. So I, as somebody who studies this, my first task is to try to get as many, get the different perspectives that are there. And also to try to, to if I'm writing about it, which I haven't thus far, at least, to present those different perspectives. And within those perspectives are some who don't see it as a problem, quite the opposite, and some who are deeply in pain because of it. And it's probably the case from what I've observed and also studied, that for some it isn't a problem.
Yeah.
And frankly, for some, my opinion is that for some it probably does help them. That is to say, I know some individuals who are amazing, who are, let's say, Talmidei Chachamim, to use the vernacular, to use the they are really good at learning other things. And it seems like learning so much Gemara has helped them. These are people, let's say, in a few cases who've been my chavrusas, who I've learned with, and then we'll talk about all sorts of things, and they'll be like really quick to pick it up. Would they be that way anyway? Maybe it didn't help that they were learning. I don't know. Maybe they're just that kind of people. Maybe there are other factors. At the same time, there are some people who clearly have suffered. And I don't think it's just coincidental. I think it's because they are the kind of people, maybe they weren't made to learn. Remember that we're witnessing an experiment for the first time in Jewish history, where all of these people are learning, expected to be learning all the time. Well, that, there's a lot of people who are not into that.
Yeah. I think it could be, personally, I think the male education could be very damaging in the sense that it's extremely taxing. How many kids are set up to sit with tiny text and for hours on end with the Rebbe and the Stecken, But
Yes.
I think that it's interesting that I have heard from someone in the community who was critical of me for having argued that the poverty, the way it's portrayed, is not quite what it is. Said, yeah, it's true that it's not the end of the world economically, but we need to use this argument in order to actually progress change. So I was saying, I think the problem with men's education is that how extremely taxing it is psychologically, emotionally on children. And I was critical of the narrative that is driving, for instance, Yafed, the organization that's fighting for change in education, that they set up the economic argument. So this friend of mine said, I'm not necessarily saying that economic argument is true, because he's well off and he's doing well.
Yeah.
He's saying, but we need to say it in order to create.
It's an interesting question, right? I mean, as we were talking, I was thinking, it's true that often the arguments are economic primarily, and often the arguments that are made by critics, and often the argument that's made by Hasidim themselves to defend it are economic as well. And I think on both sides, those who are focusing, let's say, if they're focusing exclusively on the economic, they're missing, or they're avoiding other things that are actually more complicated. Things like, what does it mean to be a citizen? Or what are the impacts in other ways of not being exposed to certain things? Because then you start getting into more sensitive, culturally sensitive things, and about the right or at least ability of any community to educate their children in a way that diverges from, let's say, the majority norms and so on, and alternatively, does the state have the ability to enforce certain kind of education beyond just the preparing people to make a living? And if so, what are the criteria that they're using for that material to say, you need to learn this? Because then you have to say, well, you need to learn this for this reason. It's a lot easier to just say, well, you need to learn this so you can make a living. But when you say, oh, it's not about making a living, or not only about making a living, it's also for this other reason. That's what, as we know, there are so many open debates as well as implicit conflicts going on right now that have nothing to do with the Hasidic community, right?
Right.
But this could connect to that, be connected to it. And so that's also one of the issues. And I think a lot of people want to just punt the ball, as it were, and say, you know what, I don't want to get involved in this. But
That's
as I
very
said, so
I think we see that with the housing, how they framed the housing argument. We need affordable housing, which was very interesting to me, that they strategically say that when what they mean is also we need insular housing neighborhoods.
Yeah, I think that this gets back to the whole realization starting in the 1960s, and here's interesting. I mean, this is another example, but on the communal level, of how the Hasidic community, and not only in Williamsburg but other Hasidic communities, very quickly learned the ropes when it came to government programs. Of course, the Hasidic community, and I shouldn't say of course, but it should be pointed out, the Hasidic community in Williamsburg was ahead of the game, and actually other Hasidim from other neighborhoods would come to the Hasidic community of Williamsburg to get help. For example, applying for some government programs. Even Lubavitchers would come from Crown Heights, even when there was a lot of tension, to try to get help with different things, because they had. So that suggests, now that wasn't just a matter of like people who had been learning Talmud and then suddenly they're able to do. No, in fact, people, as we read about in the book, of that generation had already, in some cases, been bankers in Slovakia or businessmen back then. So they've already had certain savvy, and they were also devoted Hasidim of the old Teitelbaum. So, and now it's, especially now with the internet, it's difficult. It's, of course, people aren't getting educated, but what's interesting to ask whether or not the internet is filling in certain gaps in, quote, that formal education is not providing, but on the individual level for people who then seek out information, who are learning things, not necessarily in a rigorous, way, but because education is not just about formal education; it's also about what are the different sources of information that you have that form your perspective on things.
Right. So you're proposing, are you saying that it's a very interesting thought, that sort of in absence of this kind of formal education, the internet is sort of stepping in? Because I think there are a number of things that are stepping in, probably community network of information. Yeah. Which might be on Kabelstiebel or on iWelt as well.
Yeah, I think all of those things. Again, this is a broader question. To what extent are young people where are young people getting much of their information? Are they getting most of it from
schooling, formal schooling?
Or are they getting it from their own kind of individual web searches? Or are they getting it from their own communities, online communities, whatever they happen to be? It could be Kabelstiebel for Hasidim. It could be some other thing for, other people, so it's just another example of how, Hasidim are very much human beings in wherever they are, right? I mean, they're human beings first, but then they're also people living in America, people living in Israel, whatever, and they even as they are very strongly Hasidic. So, that's always really, to get back to your point about humanizing them, it's always important for any group to realize on some level, you're still looking at human beings.
Do
you know what I mean? No matter how different they seem, no matter how much you can't understand what they're saying, what they're doing, etc., you can be assured
that they're still human beings. Unless, I don't know, they're aliens. How do you know?
Aliens, yeah.
I find that the community, the people online themselves have a very hard time with understanding, or several of the ones I come in contact with often will express an inability to grasp what the meaning of humanizing, or rather they will frame it in defending or in fighting anti-Semitism. And, they will expect a certain kind of defense instead of.
I think that many problems, misunderstandings, and sensitivities, etc., stem from, and maybe you and I agree on this, I don't know, but stem from the inability to see these other people in front of you, whether it's Hasidim or Blacks or whoever, as human beings. Of course, there are specific features of anti-Black racism or anti-Semitism or sex, etc., sexism against women, that have to be taken seriously and inflected in different ways and produce the historically specific forms of oppression and so on that we've seen. But then on some fundamental level, it's also like you just don't see them as,
as people,
as human beings. And, with Hasidim, it's like, it's very important. I tried, and I hope I didn't slip into it here, like to not say like Hasidim think this or Hasidim feel that or Hasidim, you know what I mean? Because it's like my answer to the question of like, well, was it hard to talk to people in Williamsburg? Well, yeah, some people, yeah, because some people don't want to talk, period. They're, or they certainly don't want to talk to someone who's not a member of the, whatever. There's a whole variety of things. Some people are super friendly. You could take them and put them in wherever, and they would want to talk to you about things. You have to be aware, though, that maybe those people aren't necessarily, that they're perhaps giving you a certain perspective on things.
Right. Of course. The people, as you said earlier, the people who don't talk are also saying something, it happens very rarely that we on our tours have confrontation. But this Sunday, for instance, there was this guy who was revving his school bus engine, being very passive aggressive. Now he's a minority. Most people are either friendly, people are savvy enough. And this, I think, is in the book with the bike lane conversation. You see that savviness about not making trouble where it's not necessary. So they don't bother us generally. But, the person who revs his engine is expressing his version of things. And it's part of anyway, in New York City, what I've found as a tour guide that surprised me has been that I've been yelled at by non-Hasidim who are frustrated with me, who don't like where I'm standing, and
sure.
it kind of, some people are interrupting us that are not Hasidic. It's essentially, it's very obvious to me walking down the street how
Sure.
much there's a whole range of different people with different perceptions. And
yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, right, it is New York. Although you could find the same thing elsewhere. Yeah. I do want to say one thing, though, about this question of human. It is also especially important with a community like Hasidim and Jews more generally, actually, who sadly there have been times when Jews were not described as human, literally.
Yeah.
Literally non-human. And so for a community like that, humanizing them is especially important, I think.
I wrote an article for the Forward where I talked about the community's memory of, which I think is very present, of those dark times. And it was interesting that they described it as Jewish neuroticism. It struck me as, I don't know, I guess modern Jews don't like to, maybe there's a desire to not sound like you're welling in that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of it just has to do with how you're brought up, I think. But that's kind of an obvious thing. I'm specifically thinking about if you're raised in a community in which this something like the Holocaust, for example, looms large, then it really shapes or a family like that, it shapes who you are and how you see things in very profound ways. And it's understandable if you're not, even if you're Jewish even if you're Jewish, you may not be, I think what you're pointing to is maybe there is a some distance, a gap. But it's a good question, actually, going forwards, to what extent will the Holocaust be seen as a foundational event for future generations of Hasidim in the same way that it was for previous generations?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I guess it's probably less so, but yeah.
Yeah, well, obviously, it's very different.
Yeah.
We grew up with the stories, and it's bound to, for better and for worse, obviously.
Yes.
So I just want to finish because I was going to ask you about the Minhag Project, which strikes me as the biggest project anyone's ever undertaken. What is it?
It'll be interesting to see what happens. Something could happen or nothing.
What is it? Describe it.
What it is a, so one of the books I did was a translation of this ethnographic questionnaire that this ethnographer and poet and playwright and songwriter and revolutionary named Ansky, who lived at the 19th and early 20th century, and he did an expedition into the Pale of Settlement in Russia, where most of the Russian Jews lived, and he realized that he wasn't going to be able to collect all the different customs and traditions and so on that he was interested in, so he decided to make a questionnaire. It's over 2,000 questions about life and death in the the shtetls, in the small Jewish towns of the Pale of Settlement. And he never distributed it because World War I started, and then he had to escape the Russian Empire. He eventually died a few years later. But I translated it and I annotated it, and I published a book on it. And what I've done now is digitized it, and I have been working with computer scientists to create a questionnaire that can be answered by people now online. People can create accounts, and they can answer in either Yiddish or Hebrew, and they can and their answers will be archived. And so I'm interested in seeing what a questionnaire that was developed 100 years ago for Hasidim, because it was especially for Hasidim, how it would be answered by contemporary Hasidim.
I see.
And there's, when you create an account, it asks you which Hasidic community you belong to. It asks, there's like a list of, I can't remember how many communities, but you can also add your own if it's not on the list. And then also where your parents and grandparents came from, so that your answers, whatever your answer is, to say to question 100, will also be flagged by where your grandmother came from or what community you belong to. And then we can tell people who answered question 100.
I see. You're doing the mapping,
all of that kind of
technology.
Stuff, yeah.
Oh, that's cool. That's great.
So
okay. So you're not just taking every minhag that anyone has and you try to collect.
It's around
Gotcha.
It's around these particular questions.
Oh, that's very interesting. Well, thank you so much for talking to me. I really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I've learned a lot from, I didn't get a chance to say it, but I've learned a lot from the things you've written, and also from your website and the things you've collected. Yeah,
well, it's sad that for years I've been losing stuff, but I'm getting better at putting it up before I lose it, because I think that I'm seeing that if it gets lost, it's very hard to retrieve it again, But I'm going to go to the New York Public Library now and start to see what there is there that might be a nugget.
I mean, your stuff, what you've already collected, is probably the most important archive of its kind.
Well, there isn't really a competition, is there?
That's correct, but that says something. And also, even if there were, this would be, I mean, you have an eye for a lot of really interesting things that that researchers, as well as just people who are interested in the community, can benefit a lot from.
Thanks. Well, I really enjoyed talking to you, so I'm gonna let you go. I'm gonna send you the recording.
Thank you so much.
When it's on YouTube. All right. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.